The Supreme Court's decision to gut Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is not just encouraging Democrats to redistrict themselves, it's also renewing calls within the party to pack the court. And there is still a question, of course, that remains of whether moderate Democrats, if given the power to do so, have an appetite for reforming the courts in that way. Joining us, reporter at The Bulwark, Lauren Egan, founder and president of the Searchlight Institute, and former chief of staff for Senator John Fetterman, Adam Gentleson. Elaine Kmark still with us. Lauren, this is your reporting. What do you got?
Yeah, Katie, thanks for having me. Look, I think this VRA ruling last week really was kind of a jolt for some Democrats who feel like the Supreme Court has just increasingly become a partisan actor. Obviously, this decline in trust in the Supreme Court has been going on for years, but that VRA ruling is essentially going to end Black political power in the South as we know it, and that's landing really heavy in the Democratic Party. And folks that I talked to in the Democratic Party kind of said, look, we've reached a point where we have to seriously consider real court reform. This was obviously a conversation that was happening in the 2020 Democratic primary, but it was kind of on the fringes.
With the recent wave of Supreme Court rulings, one question is back at the center of American politics. Should Democrats expand the Supreme Court when they take power again? And honestly, this is a question Democrats should have answered years ago. One of the biggest failures of the Biden administration was refusing to seriously reform the court. Biden came into office, created a commission, let it study the issue for months and months, and after all that waiting, nothing meaningful happened.
Joe Biden, who obviously won that primary, never really embraced court reform. He's kind of the institutionalist, and that was his whole brand. But when I talked to folks in South Carolina, which, as we know, it is the first primary state that, of course, could change going into 2028. But let's say South Carolina is the first primary state. When I was talking with officials in South Carolina, they said, look, this is a state with a lot of Black Democratic primary voters. They're going to want answers from these candidates that are coming already to this state to visit. They're going to want answers about how they plan to restore the VRA. And a key component of that is probably going to be some sort of court reform, whether that's expanding the court, term limits, what have you, but they're looking for answers.
Let me play the conversation, part of the conversation you had with Ro Khanna about this. Oh, you know, it's not a full conversation, it's a full screen. He said to you, the Supreme Court is totally out of touch with the racism that still exists and racially polarized voting in the Deep South. They dealt a severe blow to the next generation of Black leadership. We must have term limits on justices and look at expanding the court. Reforming the court must be one of the highest Democratic priorities.
The country was watching. Voters were angry. People understood that the Supreme Court was moving in a dangerous direction, and instead of acting, Democrats studied the problem until the moment passed. Now the question is even bigger. If Democrats expand the Supreme Court, won't Republicans just do the same thing when they get power again? Won't that start a judicial arms race where each party keeps adding more justices every time it controls Washington? And the honest answer is yes.
Again, so that's, repeating much of what you were saying there, Lauren. I wonder, the question we asked at the beginning is whether moderates are going to have an appetite for this. And Adam, you're well positioned to answer that for me. And by the way, I just want to say, as we're talking about this, Tennessee has just approved its new maps, and it's a wipeout, 9-0, 9 Republican districts, 0 Democratic districts in that state.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described, and then, the court's ruling last week, I think moderates are more willing to consider a much wider array of reforms than they were even a few years ago. And I think that's due to the extreme politicization we've seen of redistricting and of the Supreme Court itself. And so this notion that the Supreme Court is an apolitical actor, that it is independent, has really taken a huge blow due to the way that this conservative majority has conducted itself, being extremely sort of transparently political in its rulings, veering one way or the other depending on the outcome that they wanted to find, rather than sort of being consistent in applying judicial principles or neutrality. And I think that's opened their minds to sort of a broader array of of reforms, I think you still are going to struggle to get to a majority for something like expanding the court if you have sort of a very narrow Senate majority of 51 seats or 52 seats. I think if any sort of major reform to the courts is going to require Democrats to win many more Senate seats, somewhere in the range of 55, 56, 57, somewhere approaching a supermajority to actually have the votes to pass something like that. Because I think inevitably there will be defections, and you have to compensate for that in the number of seats that you win.
If Democrats add seats, Republicans will scream about court packing. They will act outraged. They will pretend the Supreme Court is some sacred, neutral institution that must never be touched. But let's be serious. Republicans have spent years reshaping the courts for political power. They block nominees when it helped them. They rush nominees when it helped them. They treated the judiciary like a political weapon long before Democrats even seriously considered reform. So Democrats need to stop being paralyzed by the fear of what Republicans might do.
So, Elaine, is there anything else beyond adding more Supreme Court justices that the Democrats might pursue?
Well, I think term limits on Supreme Court justices is something that the Democrats might pursue, or age limits, something like that. I mean, given the problem with Joe Biden and how he aged right before us and had to drop out of the presidential race, I think that given that experience, a lot of Americans are saying, maybe we ought to look seriously at either age limits or term limits or something like that. So I think that's probably more reasonable, maybe more doable than actually adding more justices. Remember that Franklin Roosevelt, the hero, one of our great presidents, couldn't manage to expand the Supreme Court. So I don't know that anybody else coming up will.
Can you argue, Elaine, or do you believe that the court does need to be expanded given this moment?
I think either expand. I do, and I'm a big moderate Democrat. Always have been. I think that this is really not. They are really not representing the United States of America in its totality, and that it does need to change somehow, either expanded or term limited or age limited or something. Because if we go on like this, they are fundamentally out of step with where America is. We saw that when they repealed Roe v. Wade, and we're seeing it again in many other decisions.
That fear has been used as an excuse for doing nothing for years. We hear it with the filibuster, we hear it with the impeachment, we hear it every time Democrats are told, if you do this, Republicans will do it back. But Republicans are already doing what they want. The question is whether Democrats are willing to fight back.
Let me ask you finally about the Supreme Court. After its ruling limiting voting rights, you called for term limits for justices and for expanding the court from 9 to 13 seats once Democrats regain full power of the government. But you have seen this redistricting back and forth play out. If Democrats expand the court, if they were to have control of both chambers, what's to stop Republicans from doing it once the tables turn again?
Kristen, first we need to talk more about this Supreme Court decision. This is a Dred Scott court. They have engaged in the fastest rollback of black political rights since Rutherford Hayes ended Reconstruction in 1877. One third of African Americans in the Congress's seats are being threatened. They're doing it to Jim Clyburn in South Carolina, to Benny Thompson in Mississippi, and across Alabama and the South. And we are not speaking up loudly enough, strongly enough against a court that is really rolling back civil rights. I do believe if you combine term limits on the court and the expansion of the court, where every president gets 2 appointees, you would depoliticize this, you would stand up for the Voting Rights Act, and you would stand up for basic American democracy. But this is an assault on John Lewis, Dr. King, and the civil rights legacy, and the Democratic Party needs to run against this court and call this court out.
If Democrats expand the court to 13 seats, Republicans may later expand it to 17. Then Democrats may respond again, then Republicans may do the same. That sounds absurd, but maybe that absurdity would finally show the public what the Supreme Court has become. Because right now, millions of Americans already see the court as political. They see precedent being treated like it only matters when the justices want it to matter. They see rights that once seemed settled suddenly reopened, weakened, or overturned. They see a court with enormous power and almost no accountability. And that is the real crisis.
Recent polling released by NBC News shows only 22% of Americans have confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court. In the wake of that growing unpopularity, a new proposal in Congress would amend the Constitution to implement 18-year term limits on Supreme Court justices. Other similar proposals have failed to gain traction in Congress throughout the years. Maryland Democratic Congressman Johnny Olszewski joins me now. He is the lawmaker proposing this bill. Congressman, it's so great to see you in my old stomping grounds. What makes your proposal different from past attempts, I wonder, to implement term limits?
Thanks, Mija. It's great to be with you. And what I will say is this is a very straightforward constitutional amendment to really address that confidence crisis that we're facing with the Supreme Court right now. This is a proposal that will cap all terms to 18 years, something that is overwhelmingly supported not just by Americans, but by Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike. It's something that I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will step forward and address, given the upending of decades of precedents, given the ethical concerns that we've seen with the Supreme Court, and given the political gamesmanship that we've seen with and around appointments.
And Congressman, given what we just heard about that low percentage of Americans who have confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court, do you think that there's a bigger appetite from the public to have more term limits right now?
Yeah, I hear overwhelmingly from my constituents, I think especially around the Supreme Court, a desire to see term limits. I know that term limits are widely supported generally, something I support personally in other cases as well. But what I can say is, in the case of Congress, I personally have to stand before the voters every 2 years to justify returning to the United States Congress. And I think the voters in November will send a resounding message that they are not supportive of the Republican policies and practices that this Congress has.
If legal precedent means nothing, then the law itself starts to feel unstable. The Supreme Court is supposed to give the country consistency. It is supposed to protect the Constitution, not act like another partisan battlefield. But that is how many people now see it. So yes, court expansion should be on the table, but expansion alone is not enough. The better long-term solution is term limits. No justice should be able to shape American law for 30 or 40 years just because they were appointed at the right political moment. That gives too much power to chance, timing, and partisan games. A better system would allow every president to appoint a new justice every 2 years. A president who serves 4 years gets 2 appointments. A president who serves 8 years gets 4. The court could still have 9 active justices, but the process would become regular, predictable, and less chaotic.
Enacted. Unfortunately, we don't have that possibility with the Supreme Court. And so when they gut a woman's right to choose, when they undo decades of hard-fought civil rights gains, there's nothing that the American people can do. And it's especially frustrating when you see these justices rubbing shoulders with the president at state dinners, going on Fox News, and also taking lavish trips with individuals who have business before the court. I think it's important that we act, and this is a common sense, straightforward way to address those concerns.
But what about among your colleagues in Congress? Do you see a realistic path of support for this or any other similar reform for the High Court?
Yeah, ethics reform for the court, not just having a code of ethics, but actually something that's enforceable, I think is really important too. And what I will say is, I know that constitutional amendments as a former American government teacher are very hard to pass. But what I will say is this is just far too important for us not to try. I've already heard from several members of Congress who are following up with our office and joining this constitutional amendment now that it's been introduced. I look forward to working with my colleagues again on both sides of the aisle. This is not meant to be a partisan reform. This is really addressing that confidence crisis that's out there that you pointed out at the top with the public polling and the lack of confidence in the Supreme Court.
Older justices could move into senior status after a set period, no longer ruling on regular cases but available in a limited backup role. After 10, 12, or 15 years, they would fully retire from active service. That would lower the stakes of every confirmation fight. It would stop one president from shaping the court for an entire generation, and it would make the Supreme Court feel less like a lifetime political prize. The truth is simple. The current system is not working. Democrats cannot keep pretending that restraint will fix a court that has already been politicized. They cannot keep hiding behind commissions, process, and fear of Republican retaliation. If the court is broken, then reform is not radical. Reform is necessary. So when Democrats get power again, they need to be ready. Expand the court if needed, push for term limits, create regular appointments, build a system that no party can permanently capture. Because this fight is not going away. The only question is whether Democrats are finally ready to fight this seriously.